Little Johnny is in the first grade. And all semester long, his teacher has been telling him and his classmates that one of these days, they're going to get to go down to the library and check out their very own library book. And finally that day has arrived. So all of these little kids have now lined up single file behind their teacher, and they're marching quietly down to the library, and while they're walking, they're mulling over in their minds a piece of important information. And I'll tell you where they got it. From those highly educated, extremely worldly second graders. When you get down to the library, forget the books over on the far right-hand corner. Get to the books over around behind the librarian's desk in the left-hand corner. That piece of information safely tucked away. Those little kids march quietly to the library, and as soon as they hit that library door, you can forget the books, folks, over in the far right-hand corner. They have not been touched in generations. The word's out about them. Nobody wants them. They're covered with dust and cobwebs from years of disuse. But those books over around behind the librarian's desk in the left-hand corner, there's going to be a mad scramble for those books, because that's the books everybody has heard about. And if you try grabbing one of those books away from one of those little kids, you're very likely to draw back nothing but a bloody nub where your hand once used to be. Johnny's going to take that book home. And some Saturday, just like this one, after all the cartoons have gone off and there's really nothing much else left to do, he's going to remember that book. He's going to go in his room, he's going to dig it out of his backpack or his book satchel, and he's going to curl up on the couch in the living room or on the floor, on the carpet in front of the now turned off television. And he's going to begin to digest that book, front cover to back, inside and out, upside and down. And as he does, you and I, of course, both know what eventually he's going to stumble across. There they are. Those magnificent creatures, the dinosaurs. Their name actually comes from two Greek root words that mean terribly great lizards. And terribly great they were. Like our old friend Tyrannosaurus Rex, the king of the dinosaurs. In fact, his name literally means King Tyrant Lizard. He wasn't the largest. There were many larger than he by far. But if what little we think we know about him eventually turns out to be true, he may well have been one of the meanest of the bunch. There were, of course, those that were much, much bigger. Creatures like Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, Brachiosaurus, Ultrasaurus, Seismosaurus, these giant creatures with these block-long names and bodies to match. And then, of course, there were those creatures that were specially well equipped to do battle. Creatures that had an armor plating of sorts all over their bodies, spikes on their tails, horns on their heads, giant plates on their backs. Creatures like Stegosaurus, Triceratops, and others of their ilk. Marvelous creatures, to be sure. But some of you, especially if you're sitting up here closer, and you can see perhaps the length of some of those sentences or the size of that type, might be thinking to yourself, Johnny can't read all of that. Johnny's just in the first grade. Truth be told, you're probably right. He probably can't. Truth be told, maybe he doesn't have to. Maybe if Johnny can just find a quiet spot where he can sit and be left alone for a minute or two to turn a page, the real truth of the matter is, in reality, Johnny doesn't have to be able to read a single solitary word in order to get the message. Does he? You know that old saying, one picture worth 1,000 words. But what if Johnny could read? Or what if he could get some unsuspecting friend, relative, babysitter, neighbor to read it to him? What do you think he might find here on chapter 1, page 1? Where did man come from? This question has preoccupied human thought for thousands, conceivably tens of thousands of years. It's responsible for a large number of myths and for many of the world's religions. The story of creation, as told in the Bible, is a fine case in point. It is seldom taken literally now. Its simple, sweeping concepts are interpreted by most modern-day Christians and Jews as being simply symbolic of the spirit and majesty of a God. The world was not created in 6 days, even though the Bible says that it was. And this discrepancy no longer troubles most devout people. However, old ideas die hard. There are still some men and women in the United States today who believe, for example, that the earth is flat. How else, they argue, could angels preside over its four corners, as the Bible says that they do? Johnny, did you know that there are still some people in the world today who believe the earth is flat? Like the Bible says that it is. What's Johnny's reaction to that going to be? Friends, let's face it. He may only be 6 or 7 years old, but he has seen those videotapes over and over and over again. July the 20th, 1969, where Neil Armstrong set foot off onto the moon, first man in the history of the human race to do so, trained those cameras back to the earth. Johnny knows. Every schoolboy knows the earth is not flat. What Johnny doesn't know is that this book lied to him. The Bible nowhere speaks of a flat earth. In fact, it speaks of exactly the opposite. In Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 22, Isaiah, in speaking of God, said, "It is he who sitteth upon the circle of the earth." That ancient Hebrew word used for circle is the word kug, K-H-U-G. It means literally something rounded, spherical, a ball, not flat. But Johnny doesn't know that. Johnny, did you know there's still some folks today who believe the Bible's right when it says the earth is flat? And Johnny's immediate reaction? He recoils in utter shock to the suggestion. He knows the earth isn't flat. Oh, and Johnny, by the way, did you know there are still some people around who believe the Bible's right when it says the earth was created in 6 days? Now, what's Johnny's preconditioned response to that supposed to be? Anybody today see what's going on here? It's an old and familiar trick. It's used often by debaters in public disputes, and it works very well against unsuspecting audiences or very small children. You take something everybody knows is wrong. The earth is flat. You connect with that in their mind, something that you simultaneously want them to think of as wrong. The earth is flat. The earth was created in 6 days. The earth is flat. The earth was created in 6 days. Suddenly, magically, as it were, both concepts get tied together and both become wrong. It works very well. That's why writers of books like this do it. In fact, I don't think most of us today, friends, have any clue as to how well it really does work. And to get the point across to you that I'm trying to make, I'd like to mention a personal example, if I might, very quickly. Several years ago, I was invited to Memphis to give a series of lectures. It was a Saturday just like this one, except it was the last couple of days of June, first couple of days of July. It was boiling hot outside, about 95 degrees, not a cloud in the sky, beautiful western Tennessee day. But unlike today, I didn't have any lecture scheduled for the afternoon. And so the people who were sponsoring the program asked me, would you mind lecturing to some of our young people while you're here on this topic? I didn't give it any thought. I said, why, I'd be happy to. I learned a very valuable lesson that weekend. Anytime someone asks you to speak to the young people, you should always have presence of mind enough to ask, what did you mean by young? I didn't. I went into an auditorium just about the same size as this one. The whole right-hand section, almost half the way back, filled with first, second, and third graders. Being the highly astute lecturer that I am, I noticed two things very quickly. Number one, my prepared lecture on embryonic recapitulation, the second law of thermodynamics, wasn't going to work here. And number two, these children did not want to be there in the first place. I know it's shocking, isn't it? Their mothers have made them come to the church building on Saturday and take a bath. And they were not happy campers. And they wanted me to know that. It's like before I ever got there, they just huddled together and said, let's don't listen to him. He can't make us. I stood up before them. They did not even so much as acknowledge my presence in the room. They didn't look up, didn't stop talking. There was one little boy on about the third row, had the little girl's hair in front of him pulled back so tight, her eyes were giving it this number. And there was one little boy on the back row, had a mouthful of spit wads going to last him the whole hour. They wanted me to know, we're not interested in anything you have to say, and there's nothing you can say to make us interested. So I realized I was in serious trouble here. I just scrapped the lecture that I had planned to give. It was useless anyway under the circumstances. And I raised my voice to get above all the noise that they were making, and I said, hey, what do you guys know about dinosaurs? Instantaneous silence. Shocked them so bad that little boy let go of that little girl's hair. Her eyes almost went back to normal. Shocked them so bad that little boy on the back row swallowed his whole mouth of spit wads. You could hear them go down with a, that was that. You want to get a kid's attention? You just mentioned the word dinosaur. Why? Folks, you can go to the zoo in San Diego and see a llama. You can go to the zoo in Chicago and see a yak. But there isn't any zoo you can go to see a dinosaur. Oh, you can go to the Museum of Natural History in Denver or New York City and see the old dinosaur bones, about 7/8 of which are actually put together by plaster of Paris and hooked together by baling wire. But folks, there is no place you can go to see a real live dinosaur. And we all have these questions about them, don't we? That roam through the canyons of our minds. How big were they, really? What was their skin like to reach out and touch it? What color was it? How big were their eggs? How big were their youngsters? What did they eat? What was it like to watch them fight? Where did they go? All these questions that from cradle to grave intrigue us. And so I had their attention. And I thought while I had it, I had better jolly well make good use of it. And my idea was to let them talk to me. Maybe they'd work out some of that nervous energy, and then they'd be willing to listen to what I had to say. So I asked them, I said, what do you guys know about dinosaurs? Tell me. Anybody in here ever thought about writing a book by this title? Everything you always wanted to know about dinosaurs but were afraid to ask? I know some kids in the first, second, and third grades in Memphis that could have written this book for you. These little kids knew everything. And you grandparents and parents in here today, see if this rings a distinct familiar bell. These little kids, 6, 7, 8 years old, they could pronounce those giant, jaw-breaking, polysyllabic names with the greatest of ease. Why, Tyrannosaurus, Parasaurolophus, Seismosaurus, Pterodactyl just rolled off without them missing a beat one. And anything you wanted to know about them, they could tell you how big they were, how long they were, what they ate last Friday at 5 p.m. for supper. You name it, they had it. And were happy to tell you anything you wanted to know about them. So I just let them talk. And boy, did they talk. And they talked and they talked and talked and talked. And finally, when they were just about to wind down, I looked at them with sort of a disappointed look on my face, and I said, "That's it?" Well, I said, "That's all real interesting, but why in the middle of that discussion did you leave out the most important piece of information of all? Why'd you do that?" And you should have seen the looks on their faces change. Noses crinkled up and furrows came into little brows as scowls crossed their faces, and you could see what they were thinking. Who? Us? Leave something out? No way. I said, "Oh, yes, you did." I said, "Why in the midst of this discussion did you not tell me anything about the men who lived on the earth at the same time as the dinosaurs?" And all of a sudden it got eerily quiet. And you could see their little eyes darting first to the left and then to the right as they looked at their little friends sitting on either side of them. One little boy toward the back, he didn't know that I saw him. He leaned over to his buddy and went like this. You could tell what he was thinking. How tall a tree did this poor fellow fall out of? And finally, there was one little boy. I never will forget this child. I don't know his name, but I will never forget him. He was sitting right up here on the front row, right underneath my nose. He was the leader of the pack. He was a third grader. And he had this great, big, deep, husky voice for a third grader, and this child hated silence more than any kid you've ever met in your life. If you took time to breathe between two sentences, he felt like it was his duty to fill in the quiet spot for you. And he couldn't stand it anymore. I guess he got caught up in the flavor and excitement of the moment, and he forgot where he was. He stood up right out of his chair, put his hand on his hip, very sternly looked me in the eye and said, "Mister, what in the world is wrong with you?" He said, "No men ever lived on the earth at the same time as the dinosaurs." I said, "They didn't?" And little heads all over the auditorium went like this. I said, "Are you sure about that?" And little heads went like this. I said, "Well, when did the men come along? How did they get here?" He didn't stutter, didn't stammer, changed hips, changed hands, looked me in the face and said, "Mister, for crying out loud," he said, "dinosaurs evolved 170 million years ago." He said, "Men didn't evolve till 3 million years or so ago. 65 million years after the dinosaurs had become extinct." "Oh," I said, "I see." "Well, tell me something," I asked. "Those men, by any chance, did they look anything like this?" Yeah, that's them. They said that's them. They got all excited. Said, "That's them, the cavemen. Yeah, that's them." I said, whoa, wait a minute. Time out. Where did you learn that? And one little girl sitting up here on the far right-hand corner raised her sweet little hand, and I called on her, and she said, "From our weekly reader." "Oh, you parents know, don't you, about the weekly reader? Our children bring it home, as its name implies, week after week to read it. We don't ever check it. It's just the weekly reader." Maybe we should. You never know what your children are going to be taught from seemingly the most innocuous of sources. One little boy raised his hand and said, "Our teacher at school said it was true." An authority figure that a child greatly respects at a young age spoke on this matter. One little boy raised his hand and said, I saw it in the National Geographic. My mom keeps on the nightstand beside the bed in her room. You know, National Geographic. Slick paper, full color, beautifully and professionally produced. This particular issue I'm holding in my hand is the November 1985 edition. If I get the light on it at just the right angle, maybe you can figure out why I use it as a sample this afternoon. It has on the front cover a holographic image. Only the second time in National Geographic's history they have ever done this, a very expensive process, of one of our alleged ancestors from an evolutionary viewpoint. And in fact, much of this issue is on human evolution. It has fold-outs within it that a grown male adult can barely hold between two outstretched arms, just to show us, our children, our grandchildren, exactly where it is that we and they are alleged to have come from in an evolutionary scenario. And if you'd like an update on this, you can check out the March 1992 edition. It puts this one to shame. Then my little front row friend up here, he had to get in his 2 cents worth, as he always did. And he said very simply, but oh, so effectively, I saw it in the book. That settles that, doesn't it? In the mind of a child, doesn't that often settle? It was in the book. Looks like, doesn't it, the Time Life photographer walked out to the wilds of Africa with his handy-dandy Canon camera and click, click, there it is. It's in the book. I saw it at school. My teacher said it was true. Anybody in here seeing my point this afternoon? Ladies and gentlemen, these were not children that I herded together at random from some local shopping mall in Memphis. These were our children. Every one of them had been reared in a faithful Christian home. Over half of them attended a Christian academy in Memphis locally. And do you know they had never seen the material that you're about to see? Do you know that little boy on the front row argued with me tooth and nail the whole cotton picking hour? I'd say something and he'd go, "That's not right." And we'd have to stop and talk about that a few minutes. And then I'd go on and say something else. He'd go, "That's not right either." And we had to stop and talk about that a few minutes. He argued with me the whole hour. Was I angry at him? No. Of course not. What was you expect him to do? Somebody waltzes off the street he doesn't know from Adam, teaches him exactly the opposite of everything the book says, the teacher said, and everything else says. What would you expect him to do? Roll over and play dead? No. He's going to argue with you. Why? One reason. Because somebody out there did their job better than and before we did ours. That's why. We abdicated, got busy, said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have time to teach my kids. Somebody else will teach them." Of course somebody else will teach them. Folks, there's always somebody waiting in the wings to do that which you and I either don't want to do or refuse to do. The question this afternoon becomes, do we want our children taught this material, or would we instead, rather that they see, if I might use the words of that famous news commentator of our generation, the rest of the story? That's what the lecture this afternoon is about. It's the rest of the story, and the most intriguing story it is. It begins in the year 1929. A scientist from the state of California by the name of Dr. Samuel Hubbard, honorary curator of archaeology at the Oakland, California Museum of Natural History. Dr. Hubbard enjoyed a world-class reputation. He was an expert in the archaeology of American Indians. And his whole lifeline, his whole professional career, he harbored a hunch It wasn't a theory. He didn't have any evidence to support it. It was just a hunch, a gut feeling. He believed the American Indians had been in this country a lot earlier, and thus a lot longer than we ever had discovered them as being here. But he had not a shred of proof. What he did have was that world-class reputation. And because of it, eventually he was awarded a sizable research grant by a wealthy philanthropist from California, whose name is still widely respected in the state today, a man by the name of Mr. Doheny. In fact, Dr. Hubbard formed what came to be known in the history of science as the Doheny expedition to the Grand Canyon in Arizona. He assembled a top-flight team of research archaeologists. They went to a section of the Grand Canyon in Arizona known as the Havasupai area of the canyon. They even stayed in the old El Tovar Hotel on the south rim of the canyon that's operated to this very hour by the National Park Service. They were looking in the Havasupai area of the canyon for Indian artifacts, pieces of pottery, arrowheads, campfires that long since had grown cold and old, dwelling places, anything they could find to document the Indians' presence here years gone by. And lo and behold, Dr. Hubbard's hunch turned out to be right. He stumbled across one of the greatest finds in American Indian archaeology to date. He found the pieces of pottery, the campfires, the dwelling places, the arrowheads, the folks. That isn't all that he found. Dr. Hubbard stumbled across the Indians' wall drawings that had been carved into solid rock walls of that canyon by obviously talented artisans, but long since covered over by the winds and sands of time, and thus perfectly preserved in the process. Once the archaeologist's pick and brush removed all those centuries of dirt, there were the drawings, practically like the day they had been made. Drawings of what? Oh, a variety of things. Cattle, sheep, dinosaurs, buffalo, oxen, horses, men. Run that list by me one more time. Cattle, sheep, buffalo, men, oxen, horses, and dinosaurs? Yes. In fact, would you like to see what Dr. Hubbard said regarding the dinosaur drawings? Dr. Hubbard said, taken all in all, the proportions are good. The huge reptile is depicted in the attitude in which man would be most likely to see it, reared on its hind legs, balancing with its long tail, either feeding or in a fighting position, possibly defending itself against a party of men. And you'll notice that nearby they even found dinosaur tracks preserved in the so-called Triassic stratum of the geologic time scale. According to the evolutionists, that would be over 165 million years before men got here. This afternoon at the 3:30 lecture, I'm going to show you how far off that kind of a date really is. Maybe some of you would like to take a peek at a reproduction of the petroglyph off of the canyon wall. Dr. Hubbard reproduced it in one of his scientific monographs. In fact, several years ago, workmen in the Oakland Museum of Natural History were refurbishing a basement area, and they came across several old boxes that were stuck away in a corner, covered with dust. Once they blew off the dust, opened the boxes, there they found copies of Dr. Hubbard's original monograph. They didn't need them, so they let the word out in the scientific community, if you had $15 for that, you could buy one of them. So I sent them $15, and they sent me one. Out of that scientific monograph came this reproduction. I hate to be the one to break it to you this afternoon, but that's just not a cow. Folks, it's not a horse. It's not an ox. It's not a goat. It's not a buffalo, but it's a terrific representation, isn't it, of a dinosaur? In fact, if you'll check out any book on dinosaurs, even those written by the evolutionists, you'll find a picture in those books, almost every one of them, of a dinosaur called Edmontosaurus. It is identical to that creature in every respect. identical. That raises an interesting question, doesn't it? In fact, I suspect every one of you is sitting there at this very moment asking yourself this question. It's the first question that naturally pops to mind. If these Indians had never seen a dinosaur or talked to somebody who had, so that information could be passed down faithfully orally, how would these Indians have known how to draw a representation of an animal they had never seen, had never had described to them, and do it so accurately a scientist coming along hundreds of years later would say, yes, the depiction is actually made in the way the Indians should have been seeing it, reared on its hind legs, balancing with its long tail. Friends, that's no easy question to answer. In fact, let me prove that to you. Several years ago, I was in the state of California, where Dr. Hubbard was and where the museum was located. It was a Thursday evening. I was involved in a public debate there. There were two of us creationists, two evolutionists, and at the end of that 2-hour-long debate, there was a 1-hour-long question and answer period, during which anybody in that 400-member audience could ask any of us anything they wanted. One of the questions asked of us was this, as creationists: how do you people deal with the problem of the dinosaurs? And I made it clear on that occasion, folks, we don't have a problem with dinosaurs. Do we believe they existed? Oh, of course. We have their fossils on all 7 continents. Literally, Arctic to Antarctic and all 5 in between. I said, we don't have a problem with dinosaurs. In fact, it's our evolutionary colleagues who have the problem. Because we have the evidence from science and from the Bible to show that these magnificent creatures actually lived on the earth at the same time as man. I said, in fact, let me show you some of that evidence. So on that evening, I put this transparency up, explained to the audience what I've just explained to you, and then walked over to sit down to let my evolutionary colleague come respond to it. He got up out of his chair like he was stuck there by Grandma's old-fashioned Ozark molasses. And when he finally got to the microphone, he looked at the transparency and he looked at the audience. He looked at the transparency and looked at the audience, and he said, well, I have to tell you, first of all, I've never even seen this material before. He boasted during the debate of having taught evolutionary biology in university systems of California for 2 decades. He wasn't very far from where this find originally resided. It was in the very state from which Dr. Hubbard was from, and he's never seen this before? No, of course not. Why? Friends, this material has been expunged from the textbooks. You're not going to find this put in a kid's textbook in a public school. If you were to put this in a kid's book, it wouldn't take a kid 15 seconds to figure out men and the dinosaurs had to have lived on the earth together. You know what his explanation was on that evening? It's on videotape on the back table in the foyer for you to look at. He said before about 400 members, standing room only audience, well, the only thing I can say is the Indians just imagined. They dreamed up. They invented a creature, carved it in the canyon wall, and it looks like one of the dinosaurs we know really lived and existed, surely by coincidence. And the group of biology students he had brought with him from the university to support him in the debate, they were looking for a chair to crawl under out of sheer embarrassment. And I don't blame them. I was his opponent, and I was embarrassed for him. Folks, that is no explanation. And furthermore, this is the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Take a look at this, for example. This is a picture of animals that we call trilobites. And you can probably figure out real easily where they got the name. Tri, 3, lobes, divisions. There are 3 lobed creatures. Now, they're greatly enlarged here on the screen for you to get a good look at them. In real life, they're on the average about the size of a silver dollar. Some go a little higher, some a little bigger, a little smaller, but on the average, about the size of a silver dollar. They're marine arthropods, or at least they were, so far as we know. They're extinct today. Marine arthropods, that means they lived in seawater. Keep that in mind. That's going to become important in just a moment. And they had a hard exoskeleton, or outer skeleton on them. You'll notice from the transparency that these are what are called an index fossil for the Cambrian period of the geologic timescape. Let me explain that to you very quickly. Many of you probably are familiar with the fact that geologists have given names to the various layers of the earth. The very bottom layer, the oldest layer, the basement rocks of the earth, that layer is called the Precambrian. The very next layer up, the next to the oldest layer on the earth, according to evolutionists, is the Cambrian. 450 million years before men got here, folks, supposedly. From an evolutionary viewpoint, almost 500 million years before men got here, trilobites were here. Anytime you find a trilobite, that is an index. That means it doesn't matter where you find it. Bottom of the ocean, top of a mountain, anything in between, it doesn't matter. If you find a trilobite, that's an index. What's the index based upon? The index is based upon the fact that evolution is true. Since evolution is supposed to be true, you'd have only the simpler animals formed first. It doesn't matter where you find the animal. If you find it on top of a mountain, that had to be Cambrian stratum. That is where this animal was evolving. It was one of the simplest living things on the face of the earth, they said. And it was one of the first things to evolve, they said. June of 1968. A gentleman from Utah by the name of Mr. William J. Meister was out fossil hunting with a lot of his friends. He and these friends used to go fossil hunting a lot on the weekends. Mr. Meister and his friends had whole collections of trilobites. They wanted to add to their already existing collections. So they decided in this June day of 1968 to go somewhere they hadn't been before, new territory, not far from Delta, Utah, or Antelope Springs, Utah. They began by going up the side of the mountain. And by the way, the story I'm giving to you, Mr. Meister wrote himself. And it was eventually published in a book edited by the renowned rose geneticist of our generation, Dr. Walter Leonard. In this book, Mr. Meister says these folks that were with him and he went straight up the side of the mountain. It was over 2,000 feet straight up. They had to dig handholds in the rock, he said, to get up to this ledge where they were trying to go. Once they got up there, they began to knock around on the rocks with their hammers, and he hit one of the rocks to loosen it to see if there were any fossils in it. When he hit it, the thing split wide open into approximately two halves right before his eyes. And inside the rock, now, ladies and gentlemen, may I remind you, up until the point he hit it, it was closed. So what I'm about to describe to you couldn't have been faked or forged or altered in any way. And secondly, there were numbers of credible witnesses there who attested to what happened. They saw it. Inside the rock, Mr. Meister found the trilobites. And you say, well, so what? That's what he was looking for. True. He just never dreamed he was going to find them embedded in the footprint of a human wearing a sandal. But he did. Folks, if evolution is correct, trilobites and humans were separated by almost 500 million years. But take a look at the reproduction of the drawing out of the book I just mentioned. Draw you a horizontal line that goes right through this transparency. This is how the rock fell open. Top half, bottom half, mirror images of each other. Notice, if you will, the black arrow. It's pointing to one of the trilobites. Follow it to the bottom and you'll see the imprint in the mirror image as well. There actually are more trilobites in the toe area. But notice the clear and compelling outline of the sandal print, complete even with a line of demarcation between the heel and the sole area of the sandal. Folks, when this was discovered, it was an absolute bomb in the evolutionary camp. In fact, one scientist from Utah, the renowned award-winning scientist Dr. Melvin C. Cook, the president of Irico Chemical Company, the author of the classic text of the early 1960s, Prehistory and Earth Models, was called in to investigate the track. He's even quoted in this book from which I'm giving you this story. Several years ago, I was in Pittsburgh on the campus of Duquesne University for a scientific meeting. And while there, one evening, a group of us scientists were waiting in a foyer to go into a banquet area where they had prepared a banquet for us. And as we were in the foyer just talking and passing the time until the doors were opened, the young man standing next to me said to the fellow standing next to him, as a man entered the doors coming off the street, he said, look, there's Dr. Cook of Utah. And that name immediately caught my ear because I had heard of Dr. Melvin Cook, and I had read this book, and I asked the young man, I said, do you mean Dr. Melvin Cook? He said, oh, yes, that's Dr. Cook. So I made my way over to him, introduced myself, told him that I had read what he had written in this particular assessment, and I asked him, I said, I just would like to talk to you face to face about it. What did you think about the trilobites embedded in the human sandal print? He said, what's to think? He said, any honest scientist is going to have to tell you there are trilobites in a human sandal print. What's wrong with that? Nothing. If you're a creationist, folks, if you're an evolutionist, you've just watched 500 million years of the evolutionary timetable disappear before your very eyes like it was an early morning Tennessee fog hit by a hot noon sun. It's there for a second and gone the next. There's no way you can have human footprints and trilobites both in the Cambrian stratum if evolution is true, and yet that's exactly what we do have. And by the way, did you pick up on anything unusual in my description of where Mr. Meister found this? I told you a moment ago that marine arthropods are what trilobites are. But he found it on the top of a mountain in Utah. We'll have more to say about what could have caused that this afternoon at the 3:30 lecture. A marine organism on the top of a mountain in Utah. But again, this is the tip of that proverbial iceberg. If I were to mention to you this afternoon this one word, the word coal, C-O-A-L, coal, what would probably spring to your mind? Would it be something like this? Vast amounts of vegetation, deep within the earth, under tremendous heat and pressure, for long periods of time, and what do you get out? Coal. At least that's what the books say, but that's not right. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, it is right that it takes a lot of vegetation. In fact, I'm going to give you a piece of information. I'd like you to do something for me. File it away in the old mental filing cabinet, because this afternoon at the next lecture, it's going to become critically important. Here's the piece of information. It does take vast amounts of vegetation to make coal. It takes 10 feet of compressed vegetation to make one single foot of peat. It then takes 12 feet of compressed peat to make a single foot of coal. Folks, when you find coal, you are talking about vast quantities of vegetation that are required to make that kind of coal. Does it take heat and pressure? Absolutely. Long periods of time, millions and millions of years. Oh, no. Folks, we've known for well over a decade it does not take long periods of time to make coal or oil or natural gas. In fact, we can make coal for you in a laboratory in less than 60 days. We can make oil and natural gas for you in a matter of less than a week. Don't look for us to heat your homes and run your cars with these processes. They're too expensive for the amounts we can produce, but we can do it. And we even know that in nature, these things can be formed in a very rapid fashion. In fact, on the table in the back foyer, you're going to find this little book. For those of you that might have an interest in this, it's a must-read. It's called Genesis and the Origin of Coal and Oil. I'd like you to take a look at it, written by a geologist. It's from this book, but it's from the evolutionists. It's a quote from evolutionists about the formation of these kinds of things, oil, coal, natural gas. Look at what they have to say. They make this comment. In many geological situations, much longer time intervals are available. In other words, don't get us wrong, we still believe in an old Earth. But evidently the molecular mechanism of decomposition is little changed by all the additional time. Thus, within sedimentary basins, heating times of several years are sufficient for the generation of oil and gas from suitable precursors. Heating times of how many millions of years? No, not millions. How many hundreds of thousands to get coal? No, not hundreds of thousands. How many thousands of, not thousands. Folks, we can produce oil and gas and coal in nature in just a few years. In fact, we've known that for, again, well over a decade and a half. Several years ago, outside of a city in Germany by the name of Freiburg, workmen had been called in to tear down an old railroad trestle. The thing was almost 100 years old, very dilapidated. They were fearful it was going to collapse and hurt somebody, so they tore it down. In its place, they intended to erect a new steel bridge. But before that could be done, one last thing had to be accomplished. The old bridge had been built on giant wooden pilings driven deep into the earth to sustain that wooden superstructure. So they came in with huge cranes, wrapped these big old chains around these things, and literally just one by one yanked these big old pilings out of the ground. Their intent was to fill the holes with reinforced concrete and build the new bridge on top of that. You can imagine the workmen's surprise when they started yanking those big old pilings out of the ground, and one by one discovered that they had turned to solid coal. Folks, the bridge had been built by men. In men's lifetimes, it wasn't even 100 years old, and yet it already had coalified? Absolutely. Do you realize that in this country and in many others, we have found in coal veins things that just couldn't possibly be there if evolution's true? Coal, according to evolutionists, was formed during what's called the Carboniferous period of the geologic time scale. That would have been, if evolution's right, 250 million years before men got here. But friends, in this country and others, we have found things like, for example, United States government armed forces uniform buttons embedded in chunks of solid coal. We have found spoons, knives, forks. We have even found where one lady took a chunk of coal home, dropped it into her coal-burning fireplace. When the thing began to burn, it cracked open and a woman's sewing thimble fell out. Friends, you cannot have human artifacts in coal veins if evolution is true. They were separated by 250 million years. But the most intriguing piece of evidence is from the evolutionists themselves. Several years ago, in your neighboring state of Kentucky, there was a scientist by the name of Dr. Albert C. Ingalls, who was working in the coal veins of that state. Dr. Ingalls stumbled across, embedded in the coal, human footprints. And I'm not talking ones or twos, I'm talking entire trails. And he didn't find them just in Kentucky. Upon further examination, because of this unusual find initially, they also discovered them in Virginia, West Virginia, Illinois, westward even toward the Rocky Mountains. In fact, so many did they find that other scientists began to investigate them. One of the scientists who did was with the United Nations. His name was Dr. A.E. Wilder-Smith. Dr. Wilder-Smith made this assessment of the tracks. He said these tracks are in formations considered to be in the upper Carboniferous. That would be, again, about 250 million years old, according to evolutionists. He said they show 5 toes and an arch that is unquestionably human. He went on to say the tracks are 9.5 inches long, they're 4.1 inches broad at the heel, the width at the foot end of the track by the toes was 6 inches, and the being that left the tracks was a biped. That is, walks on 2 feet, and walked uprightly like a human, Dr. Wilder-Smith said. Well, how's Dr. Ingalls going to explain these tracks? The editors of Scientific American contacted him and asked him to do just that. They said, Dr. Ingalls, we've heard about this unusual find in Kentucky and Illinois and Virginia and West Virginia. We want you to write an article for our prestigious science journal to explain these tracks. Away. Here is an evolutionist living who can accept these tracks, folks. If you've got humans in coal, all of evolution's wrong. So Dr. Ingalls accepted the challenge. He wrote an article for Scientific American. He titled his article, The Carboniferous Mystery. What's the mystery? The mystery is, if you're an evolutionist, how you're going to explain human tracks in coal veins. That's the mystery. You want to see how he did it? From the actual article in Scientific American, here is Dr. Ingalls' explanation. Dr. Ingalls said, if man, or even his ape ancestor, or even the ape ancestor's early mammal ancestor existed as far back as in the Carboniferous period in any shape, then the whole science of geology is so completely wrong that all geologists will resign their jobs and take up truck driving. Hence, for the present at least, science rejects the attractive explanation that man made these mysterious prints in the mud of the Carboniferous period with his feet. I'm going to give every one of you in here, from the youngest to the oldest, credit with seeing that is no explanation at all. Folks, he not only didn't explain them away, he didn't explain them, period. All Dr. Ingalls could do was poke fun at it. He enjoyed a good joke out of it, got a good laugh from it, but he didn't explain it. He said, well, if this turns out to be true, all of us that are geologists have to give up our jobs and take up driving trucks for a living. To which I would say very simply, gentlemen, start your engines. And friends, my point is, I don't mind a guy with a good sense of humor. In fact, I like a fellow with a good sense of humor, especially in this controversy, where oftentimes there's been a whole lot more heat than light generated, and that is never good. Folks, a sense of humor can help you keep your perspective, can help keep emotions in check, and that's always good. But what I don't care for is a man of science who will just ridicule, mock, and laugh away the data. Do you notice what Dr. Ingalls admitted inadvertently? He said science rejects the what? The attractive explanation. Whoa, Dr. Ingalls, sir. Even you as an evolutionist admit it certainly is an attractive explanation to say man made these tracks in the coal veins. Attractive? Friends, it isn't attractive. It's the only explanation. Ask yourself, what could have made these tracks in 4 or 5 different states, every one of them looking just like human tracks? Someone might say, well, they must have been made by an animal that's got a foot like a human. All right, I'll play along. What animal might that be? And someone could say, well, maybe they were footprints of an ape. Excuse me, that's wrong on 2 counts. Number one, you correct me if I'm in error here, but I don't think that Kentucky, Virginia, Illinois have ever been renowned for their high ape populations. And number 2, folks, you've been to a zoo. You've seen the foot of an ape. It isn't like the foot of a human. In fact, in the animal kingdom, the closest thing to the foot of the human, structurally speaking, is the foot of the glacial bear. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think those states have ever been known for their high glacial bear populations either. And did you notice what else Dr. Ingalls said? He said, well, science rejects this explanation. No, it does not. Folks, that is not how science works. He's left you with the impression, whoops, science had data come in that don't fit the currently prevailing theory. Not a problem. We just throw the data out. We ignore them. We lift the living room rug, stick them under the rug, drop it, hope nobody finds out. Folks, that is not how science works. Science happily accepts all the incoming data. If those data don't fit the currently prevailing theory, you don't throw the data out, you throw the theory out. Or you modify that theory to accept the new and incoming data. And it works in every area of science, except where evolution is concerned. There, if you've got drawings by humans of dinosaurs on canyon walls, if you've got trilobites embedded in human sandal prints, if you've got human footprints embedded in coal that's supposed to be 250 million years old, you just don't put it in the textbooks. You just hide it and hope nobody finds out. I've got news for you. We have found out. Whole books have been written on this material. I'd like to recommend one on the back table to you. It's this little blue and gold book called The Mythology of Modern Geology. It's a dynamite little book. In fact, it has everything in it that I've given you this afternoon, including a reproduction off the canyon wall in Arizona of the petroglyph of the dinosaur. It has almost 100 footnotes in the back documented in the literature. It makes a great gift, not just for a youngster, but even for an adult. Very easy to read and packed with material from the scientific literature that you won't find anywhere else, that our children need to know exists. It tells a completely different story than what they are being taught in the public schools in this nation. And if time allowed me this afternoon, I could show you a whole lot more information from science. Folks, this is just the tip of that iceberg. But in keeping with my promise last evening, I want to ask you a second question. What does the Bible have to say regarding this material? This is a Bible and Science program all weekend long. It's only fair. If we're going to investigate some of the science, let's likewise investigate the Bible. What does the Bible have to say regarding the dinosaurs? If you've got your Bible with you, or if there's one in the back of the pew there in front of you, would you take your Bible and just turn to any one of those 2 or 3 places where it talks about the dinosaurs, and let's discuss them for just a moment. You see people doing what I see people doing? They're all out there with their Bibles like this. Like if somebody would just tell me where to turn, well, I will turn. Friends, if you've got a Bible in your possession and you're not turning, there could be 2 reasons, couldn't there? Number 1, it's not there, so you can't turn to it. Or number 2, it's there, but you don't know where it is, so you still can't turn to it. If you've got a Bible and you're not turning, I'd like to respectfully submit to you, it's the second one. It's there, but a lot of us don't know where. I hope when you leave today, you'll be glad you came, because isn't that what coming to these kinds of programs is all about? To teach us things that heretofore we did not know? Friends, one thing is for certain, isn't it? We cannot turn around and teach to someone else that which we ourselves first don't know. Anybody in here recall the story in the Old Testament about the patriarch by the name of Job? Remember that story? Well, I'm not going to recount the whole thing to you because everybody knows it practically from heart. Let me summarize it ever so quickly by just saying Job suffered terribly, lost everything he had. His 10 children had been killed. All of his servants had been slaughtered. His flocks had been stolen. And he literally had nothing left. He was covered with boils all over his body, from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet. Chapter 7 tells you he was out in the city dump and he was unable to sleep. Every time he fell asleep, he had horrible nightmares that immediately awakened him. He was a shell of his former self. And then, as if that weren't bad enough, Mrs. Job comes along and says, why don't you just curse God and die? And then, to make matters even worse, the text goes on to tell you he had 3 friends from afar off that heard about his plight, and they came to see him. And you've heard that old statement, haven't you? With friends like these, you don't need any enemies. That's the kind of friends these guys were. They didn't come to comfort him. They came out of idle curiosity. Everybody back then knew, if you're suffering, you have sinned. And the more you've suffered, the more you've sinned, the bigger your suffering. Wow, they thought Job's was a whopper of a sin, and they wanted to know what it was. They were licking their chops and wringing their hands, and they came and asked Job, Job, what did you do? Folks, one of the great beauties of the book of Job is to show you how wrong that kind of thinking is. Job hadn't done anything to deserve this. But he couldn't convince his friends of that. And they pressed him, and he answered them, I didn't do anything. And they pressed him some more, and he kept trying to tell them, I didn't do anything. And they pressed him and pressed him and pressed him, and it made Job so absolutely angry that in his anger he lashed out at his friends? No. He lashed out at his God. Sound familiar? And in his anger against the throne of heaven, he let slip some charges against God that he was literally going to live to regret. God would see to that. All of a sudden, without any warning, Job chapter 38 says God appeared to the old patriarch, and he chose the most unusual way to do it. He chose a whirlwind, the text says, that stood in front of Job, apparently chosen by God to show Job his complete control over nature. And from the voice of this massive whirlwind comes God, and it says, Job, gird up your loins like a man. In other words, Job, you stand up straight before me, mister. You and I are about to have a little talk here. It was a real lopsided conversation, folks. God did all the talking and Job did all the listening. You know why? Because God said in essence to Job this: Job, you think you're so high and mighty. You think you're so smart. You dare to make these kinds of charges against the throne of heaven. Let's see how smart you really are. Here, Job, answer these questions for me. Folks, there are over 50 of those questions. It takes 4 chapters of our English Bibles just to list them, with no response whatsoever given by Job to them. Little questions like, Job, where were you when I hung the foundations of the earth upon nothing? And Job, who put wisdom in the inward parts? And Job, the hoar frost of heaven, who hath gendered it? And Job, out of whose womb cometh the ice? Job, the dwelling place of light, where is it? Job, when light comes to you, where does it come from? Job, the dwelling place of darkness, where is it? When light goes, Job, where does it go? You know, little questions like those. Job couldn't answer a single one of them. Not one. And this afternoon, before you get ready to laugh up your sleeve at the ignorance of that poor old dumb patriarch, may I remind you of something? My friends, we are 3,500 years removed from him. We have at our disposal the cumulative amount of human knowledge from day one to this very second. We have computers that can do calculations of billions of calculations in a second. We have the most impressive methodology, most advanced technology ever known by the human race. And with all of that, we still can't answer more than about 5 or 6 of those same questions. It's a very humbling experience to read Job chapters 38 through 41. But this afternoon, I'm specifically interested in one of the questions God asked Job, chapter 40, verse 15 and following. God said, Job, have you seen the behemoth which I made as I made you? Job, he eats grass like an ox, but his strength is in his loins. His force is in the muscles of his belly. He moves his tail like a cedar of Lebanon. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are like tubes of brass. His limbs like bars of iron. And he is the chief of the ways of God. Job, you smart fellow, you. You see the creature standing in the faraway pasture, the behemoth? I made him, Job. He's got bones like tubes of brass, stands up on his hind legs, strength in his loins. He's the chief of the ways of God. Can you make a creature like that, Job? I did. By the word of my power, I did. Hebrews 1:3. Can you do that, Job? What is this creature? The behemoth. Friends, this is one of those words in the Hebrew in which this portion of the Old Testament was written. The translators did not know what to do with. They didn't know how to translate it, and there's a good reason. In translation, context is critical in knowing what a word means. This is the only place in the Old Testament this particular noun is used in this particular form. They had nothing with which to compare it. So they had no context. So they didn't know how to translate it. So they didn't translate it. They used a little trick in translation that's called transliteration. You take the foreign word, and where it has the letters in it, you just put in an English equivalent. So out of the Hebrew, we got the B-E-H-E-M-O-T. In other words, they just slid over into your language. They're going to let you worry about it. What is it? Well, where could you go to find out? How about the dictionary? That'd be a good place to start, wouldn't it? Go ask Mr. Webster, and he'll set your mind at ease immediately. He'll tell you what this is. In words that are unmistakably clear, this, he says, is a massive, gigantic, gargantuan creature. Well, thank you, Mr. Webster. Like we did not already know that. What we'd like to know is, what's the creature? What is this? Oh, somebody says, you lucky, fortunate fellow you. Are you going to be ever so glad you showed up in McMinnville, Tennessee this weekend? Oh, I say, why so? And you say, because my Bible out here in the margin note or in the footnote will tell you what this creature is. Oh, but what does your Bible say there? Well, depending on what version you've got, it will say one of two things. It will say a little note from the translator out here in the margin or in the footnote. Perhaps this creature is a hippopotamus. Did you ever see the tail of a hippopotamus? Little old bitty 6-inch tail sticking off a 3.5-ton hippo. Some versions say maybe it's an elephant. Did you ever see the tail of an elephant? About that big around, about a yard long, wouldn't even make a good switch for a mad mother. Folks, this creature is not a hippopotamus. It's not an elephant. These descriptions don't fit those creatures. Read it. It says this is a creature whose strength is in his loins. This is a creature who routinely stands up on its hind legs. Elephants and hippos don't routinely do that. This is a creature who is the chief of the ways of God. He was the largest land-living, air-breathing creature ever known to the human race. What is that creature? What's the largest land-living, air-breathing creature ever known to the human race? It's the dinosaur. In fact, just 8 short years ago, we found the largest one we have ever found. He stood 3.5 stories tall as the ceiling on this building. He had bones that weighed thousands of pounds each. In fact, conservatively, the scientists who reconstructed it said it would have weighed in somewhere at a minimum of 110 tons. 220,000 pounds of living, moving, breathing animal. He had a breastplate taller than a 6.5-foot tall man. You want a frame of reference? The largest male bull elephant we have ever documented weighed a measly 11 tons. This creature would make 10 of those. His name, Argentinosaurus. Bet you can't figure out where we found him. Texas. Just kidding, just kidding. Folks, this is the most massive creature we have ever discovered. Tail like a cedar tree. Sinews of his thighs knit together, bones like tubes of brass, limbs like bars of iron, chief of the ways of God. What does this sound to you like? Sounds to me like a dinosaur. And someone's going to say, well, why didn't the translators just call it that and be done with it? Very good reason. The first dinosaur bones were not discovered until the year 1822. That was the country of Great Britain. An English medical doctor by the name of Gideon Mantell had gone out to tend to a patient in the countryside. His wife, Mary Ann, went with him. While the doctor took care of the patient, Mrs. Mantell took a stroll down an old country road. As she walked, she came near a rock quarry. When she kicked one of the rocks on the path in front of her, the rock tumped over, and stuck in it were these giant fossilized teeth. She had never seen anything like it. In excitement, she took it back to her husband, showed it to him. He had never seen anything like it. They ended up eventually in the office of Sir Richard Owen at the British Museum of Natural History, the curator of the museum in London. Dr. Owen sat there with his teeth hanging out, no pun intended. He had never seen anything like this, nor did he know a scientist who had. They named it, the creature from which the teeth came, iguanodon, don tooth. It was the tooth like from an iguana, but it was much bigger. 20 years later, in 1842, Sir Richard Owen eventually coined the term dinosaur. The terribly great lizards. Ladies and gentlemen, may I remind you, the King James Version of the Bible was put into print in English in 1611. That was 231 years before the word was even invented. Not a very fair question, is it? To ask, well, why doesn't the Bible have the word dinosaur in it? The word dinosaur wouldn't even be invented in English until 231 years after this book was published. But is the description found there? Oh, indeed. Indeed it is. And in fact, God is not through with Job. If you'll turn over just one chapter later In Job chapter 41, God is asking Job this. I'm going to summarize the whole chapter for you very rapidly. He says, Job, can you throw your fishhook into the ocean and reel in the Leviathan? Leviathan? What is this creature? Oh, it says, this is a creature who strikes fear into the hearts of men when they see it. He moves through the water and causes the water to boil and to quake. And if you wanted to do battle with him, mortal combat to the death, if you had a sword, a javelin, a spear, good luck. You could hit him on his underbelly and it would bounce off like it hit a piece of pottery. What is this great creature, the Leviathan? I'll tell you first what it's not. Out in your Bible, it's probably got a marginal or footnote that says perhaps this was a crocodile. Folks, tell me something. If you were in the water where crocodiles lived and they were after you, would you ever know it? Not till it was too late. They move, the water doesn't. They're stealthy swimmers, aren't they? And if you did have in your possession a weapon, sword, javelin, or spear, and you wanted to do battle to the death with that creature, where is the first place you would try to strike him? His soft underbelly. That's where he's most vulnerable. Not this creature. This creature had an underbelly harder than a piece of pottery. You couldn't touch him. And when he moved, the water began to quake and to boil. What is this creature? Folks, this is no crocodile. And I'll tell you something else it isn't. It's not a dinosaur. Why so? It's a matter of definitions. Scientifically, dinosaurs are defined only, strictly, and solely as being land-living, air-breathing creatures. If you have an animal that lives its whole life cycle in the water, by definition, it cannot be a dinosaur. Dinosaurs never did that. They always live on land. However, there was a group of creatures that lived in the water their whole life cycle, and if you saw them in common parlance, everyday language, you would say, oh, cool dinosaur. They weren't dinosaurs. We called them, we have a name for them in science. They're called dinosaur-like water-living reptiles. Anybody ever heard of an ichthyosaurus? Plesiosaurus? Mosasaurus? All of those creatures fall into this category. If you looked at them, you'd say, oh, that's a dinosaur. But it's not by definition. It is, by definition, a dinosaur-like water-living reptile. Well, is it possible one of these creatures is what Job is being presented with by God? Yes. Yeah, well, somebody says you didn't go on and finish the chapter either. There's something else odd in that chapter. Yes, you're right, there is. It says this is a creature from whose nostrils come fire and smoke. The word that comes to mind? Dragon. I've got news for you. The word Leviathan is used in the Old Testament Hebrew 6 times. And more than once is translated dragon. Someone says, wait a minute. I thought dragons were mythological creatures from the time of Sir Lancelot, who went out to save the damsel in distress from them. Friends, there are 2 things you know about this passage for certain. One, this is no mythological creature. If it's a myth, think about what it's going to do to God's argument. God's in the middle here whittling Job down. Job got way too big for his britches. God, by the time he gets through with him, is about half the size of a toothpick. And one of the ways he spends an entire chapter in getting this point over to this old patriarch is to ask him about this creature, the Leviathan. If the creature is a myth to begin with, Job's going to turn right back to God and say, God, what's your point? It's a myth. God's whole argument collapses of its own weight. Folks, it is no mythological creature. And secondly, may I remind you today that numerous countries of the distant past, China, Korea, Taiwan, Great Britain, and many others, have in their historical, not legendary, not mythological, in their historical literature descriptions of creatures we would call today dragons. Someone's going to say, how in the world can you have an animal that could breathe fire and smoke? Ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you again of two things. Number one, that is not physiologically difficult. It's not even impossible by any stretch of the imagination. And number two, don't fail to remember that the animal kingdom contains all kinds of weird and wonderful creatures that we don't even begin to understand. And I'm sure some we have not even yet discovered. Anybody in here ever heard of an electric eel? Swims through the water. You can grab it. He can generate enough electricity to kill a man. Where's the extension cord? You've got a living system here that can produce enough electricity to actually kill something the size of a man? Yes. Anybody ever heard of a bombardier beetle? About 2 inches long. We don't generally have them in America. They're in tropical climates. And you talk about a little creature that packs a big wallop. Folks, this is it. This little beetle has a hollow tube, one on either side of its body. In each of those 2 tubes, he keeps a different chemical. When those chemicals are kept separate and apart, we say in chemistry they are inert. They don't do anything. They just sit there. They're harmless. But he doesn't keep them separated. When an animal, like a frog that is his mortal enemy, is about to chase him and chow down on him and make lunch out of him, he takes the 2 chemicals, dumps them simultaneously into the inside of his body in a long, hollow chamber where an enzyme is sitting. The enzyme does in that system what enzymes do in all systems. It acts as a catalyst. When those 2 chemicals hit that enzyme, in less than 1.8 seconds, the whole thing turns into over 212 degrees Fahrenheit, over boiling. He then, just as the frog's about to chomp down on him, opens a tiny sphincter on his tail end and bombs the creature. That's where he got the name, the bombardier beetle. With this hot, smoking, boiling, noxious, poisonous mixture of gases. Friends, the animal kingdom has things in it we don't even begin to understand. And by the way, did you ever stop to think about this kind of stuff? Folks, think about it. You've got these chemicals here. You put them together. They're highly explosive, very dangerous, poisonous, noxious, caustic. What's nature going to do to evolve that and get it right the first time? Do you realize how many beetles you're going to blow up trying to get this thing to evolve along the way? Folks, is it possible? Is it possible that there could have been an animal on a bigger scale like the bombardier beetle on the small? Oh, yes. In fact, we have actually found a group of dinosaurs. We call them the hadrosaurs. They had huge bony crests on their heads with giant hollow tubes that made their way down into the nasal area. Is it possible there was an animal who had on a giant scale the same capability for defense the bombardier beetle has on a small scale? They could blast out these boiling, smoking, noxious, caustic gases. Yes? And if you were a human and you were seeing that, and obviously you wouldn't want to get up just real close to take a good look, when you saw a couple of these animals fighting and one of them's blowing this smoking, noxious, poison mixture of gases, and you go back and you're telling everybody in the city what you saw, you say, you ought to have seen what I saw. I saw a creature out there that could breathe smoke, and haven't we always said where there's smoke, there's fire? Folks, don't forget, the Bible is written in what we call phenomenal terminology. That simply means it was written as humans see things. They observe phenomena, and the writers of the Bible describe them as we see them. The Bible says, does it not, the sun rises and the sun sets. Yes, it does. But you and I both know it doesn't do either. The sun doesn't rise or set. Oh, so then tonight, since that's the case, when the weatherman comes on at 6 o'clock and says tomorrow the sun's going to rise at 6:42 and set tomorrow evening at 5:46, you're going to call the weather station and tell them you made an error, right? No. Why? Folks, he didn't make an error. It's the kind of language he's using. He's using phenomenal language to describe things as we witness them. The Bible does that all the time. So do we. It's possible that this description of this animal is the writer observing something from a human standpoint and saying where there's smoke, there's fire. But there is a second possibility that cannot and should not be overlooked. And that is that the animal literally had the ability to breathe fire and smoke. To get this point across to you, let me use an analogy that I think you can easily understand. Have many of you in here heard about, it's been in the news a lot lately, the creature, the concept called global warming? Heard about that? Some scientists think we've got all this greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, and so on, used to escape out into the atmosphere, but it's not doing that anymore. We're producing too much, and it's settling here on the earth. And it's going to cause huge weather problems for us. It's going to melt the two poles. It's going to play havoc with all of our weather globally. Not a very pretty picture. In fact, national news magazines like this recent issue of Newsweek have had feature articles on it called Too Much Hot Air. Well, when you get home tonight, time comes for you to lay your head down on the pillow and go to sleep. Please, I don't want you to worry about this. And I'll tell you why. Because the United States government has the problem completely under control. No, it's true. And you know how I know that? Because just a couple of 3 years ago, in one of the United States government budgets from the General Accounting Office, there was a line item in that budget, I'm not making this up, designating $6 million of your hard-earned tax dollars to go to a group of scientists to study the effect on global warming of cows standing in the pasture belching methane gas into the air. And won't you sleep better tonight knowing that? That there's a bunch of scientists in white coats out there in the laboratory, in the pastures with the cows with belchometers. Folks, think about it. If our representatives and senators in the Beltway in Washington, D.C. are so concerned about global warming, they're willing to spend $6 million of your tax dollars to pay a bunch of scientists to go out here and check cattle to see how much methane gas they're belching, what kind of consternation do you think would overtake the folks in Washington if they could stumble across a herd of these animals? You want a frame of reference? That male bull elephant I mentioned a moment ago, he weighs 11 tons. He requires 300 pounds of vegetation every 24 hours just to live at minimal subsistence levels. You're talking about a creature that's 12 times that size, roughly. You're talking about a creature that would require 1.5 tons of vegetation every 24 hours. Do you have any earthly idea how much methane gas you could make from that kind of vegetation? Some scientists have suggested these animals have developed the ability to store that gas and expel it and ignite it as a defense mechanism. Friends, this is not physiologically impossible. In fact, it's not even all that difficult. Let me explain to you today what I'm talking about. Those of us who work in veterinary medicine, especially in large animal husbandry, often come across a situation that is known as bloat. Cows get it especially, and it can be very deadly. What happens is there's a rumination stomach, a fermentation stomach in the animal, and normally the gas that's produced can be released, but if it's not, the gas builds up, the stomach swells, the intestines will go gangrenous if you don't release the gas. And the farmer, the rancher, will lose his investment. It's very serious. Normally, what a veterinarian would do is this. He would come out, the cow is in the pasture, she's stiff-legged, she's not moving, she's in terrible pain, and she's not going anywhere. You take your stethoscope, run it around on the stomach areas, and you're looking for where that rumination stomach is. Once you find it, you then would normally take a long piece of rubber hose, you try to run it through her esophagus down into that stomach to release the gas. But that's not always possible. So we have an alternate method that we use, more often than not, in fact. We take a long sterile needle, it's called a trocar, And we're looking for a place to insert that needle. Generally, what we're looking for is ventral to the sternum. It's an area on the cow called the paralumbar fossa. You slide that trocar down to that leathery hide. If you're good at what you've done, you can hit that rumentation stomach. Once you've punctured it, you can lean over, take your finger off, listen for a psst. You can take your Bic lighter out of your lab coat, strike it, and you'll shoot flames from that trocar straight out 3.5 feet. You can literally sit there and let all the gas burn off. When it's finished, you can pull the trocar out, that old leathery hide goes back, hardly even any blood. The animal will get up, walk off like nothing ever happened. Unless, of course, she hiccuped during the procedure. Folks, my point is, the gas is easily ignitable. All you need is an ignition system. Some scientists have suggested two possibilities as to how these animals could have ignited that gas upon expulsion. Number one, they've suggested these animals were bottom feeders. All bottom-feeding animals eventually pick up rocks that get stuck between their teeth. It's routine. If these animals had those kinds of rocks, the suggestion has been made they could rear their heads out of the water, expel that gas, strike the teeth containing the rocks together, cause a momentary spark, and ignite the gas. Again, it's not at all physiologically impossible. Second, some have suggested that the actual water, with all of its nutrients and salt and so on, had altered the teeth to where the teeth had become flint-like. So they could literally scrape their teeth together and cause this kind of ignition system to occur. Folks, neither is impossible. And ancient history provides documented testimony from credible sources of the existence of dragons. But I think the third passage is the one that ties all of this together the best. That's the one found over in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. You may recall that in Exodus 20 is where God was giving the Israelites the 10 Commandments via Moses. Verse 8 is where Moses gave the Israelites this command: remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then he went to tell them why. He said, I want you to work on 6 days, but not on the seventh. Why? Verse 11, Exodus 20. For in 6 days Jehovah hath made the heavens, the earth, the seas, and all that in them is, and on the seventh day rested. Folks, ask yourself this question. If in 6 days God made the heavens and all that's in them, the earth and all that's on it, the seas and all that's in them, what does that leave out? It doesn't leave anything out, does it? In fact, you know it doesn't, because in Genesis 1:31, at the end of his creative activity, God looked out, and what did he say about the creation? Did he say it was good, or did he say it was very good? Very good. The first time that phraseology is used, and I'll tell you why. Folks, in the Hebrew, that means superlative. In our English vernacular, we would say, it just doesn't get any better than this.